Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. 4 years ago, the New York Times wrote this article, Losing Earth, the Decade We Almost Stopped Climate Change. 30 years ago, we had a chance to save the planet. The science of climate change was settled. The world was ready to act. Let's take a look at that article from August 1st, 2018. This narrative by Nathaniel Rich is a work of history addressing the 10-year period from 1979 to 1989, the decisive decade when humankind first came to a broad understanding of the causes and dangers of climate change. The article goes on with the usual climate propaganda and then asks the question, why didn't we act? Then they go on with a long diatribe about how the fossil fuel industry corrupted climate science. We've heard the New York Times rewrite of history. Now let's take a look at what was actually going on in 1989. This was the front page of the New York Times on January 26, 1989. U.S. data since 1895 failed to show warming trend. After examining climate data extending back nearly 100 years, a team of government scientists has concluded that there's been no significant change in average temperatures or rainfall in the United States over that entire period. December 7, 1989, analysis of warming since 1881 shows most of the increase in global temperature happened before 1919, before the more recent sharp rise in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, said Tom Carl of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's National Climatic Data Center. While global climate warmed overall since 1881, it actually cooled from 1921 to 1979, Carl said. In spite of all the well-publicized concern about global warming, you must understand that there is still considerable uncertainty among scientific experts about a number of critical factors which determine global warming, the NOAA administrator said in a statement issued for the geophysics meeting. New York Times, December 1st, 1992. Is global warming? Not yet, researchers on tree rings say. Lisa Gromlich, who examines the ring patterns of foxtail pine trees and western junipers in the Sierra Nevada, has compiled a detailed record of the year-to-year variation in temperature and precipitation over the last 1,000 years. She has seen in the North American trees the feathery but unmistakable signatures of the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age. We can now see that the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age were global climatic phenomena, not regional temperature variations, she said. And in 1998, President Clinton had zero support in Congress for signing a fake global warming treaty. New York Times, July 19, 1994. Severe ancient droughts, a warning to California. Beginning about 1,100 years ago, what is now California baked in two droughts, the first lasting 220 years and the second 140 years. Each was much more intense than the mere 6-year dry spells that afflict modern California from time to time. Los Angeles Times, June 16, 1994. Ancient trees reflect century-long droughts. In this week's issue of the British journal Nature, a Cal State Hayward professor writes that the submerged stumps in Mono Lake and other lakes in the Sierra Nevada are relics of trees that grew on land that was uncovered when droughts reduced water levels by up to 60 feet. And this information has been known since 1922, 100 years ago, when it was first published. 30 years ago, government scientists said there'd been no warming in the United States over the last century. They said that most global warming occurred before the year 1919 and that the Earth actually cooled from 1921 to 1979. They said there was considerable uncertainty about the effects of carbon dioxide. As of 1992, they said the globe was not warming. They said that the western U.S. had had much more severe droughts when carbon dioxide levels were lower 1,000 years ago. But the New York Times wants you to believe the current dysfunctional state of climate academia was settled 30 years ago and it was oil companies that prevented governments from acting. The reality is that for the past 35 years, governments around the world have been making fake climate agreements which have done nothing to slow the growth of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In 1989, the United Nations warned that we only had 10 years to save the planet from global warming. They said if we didn't stop global warming by the year 2000, the Maldives and other flat island nations were going to drown. Here's a screenshot from a Maldives webcam which I made this morning. It looks to me like the islands are still there. But things weren't always so good in the Maldives. 185 years ago in 1837, some of the islands were actually disappearing into the sea. James Hansen is the NASA scientist who started the global warming scare before Congress in 1988. He predicted in 1988 that lower Manhattan would be underwater within 20 or 30 years. He also predicted there would be a severe drought and you would have to request water in order to get it in restaurants. When did he say this will happen? Within 20 or 30 years, and remember we had this conversation in 1988 or 1989. Does he still believe these things? Yes, he still believes everything. I talked to him a few months ago and he said he wouldn't change anything that he said then. The only thing that had become settled by 30 years ago was climate scientists making ridiculous predictions which had no possibility of coming true. Another thing that hasn't changed is the New York Times spewing nonsense about climate. In 1995, the New York Times predicted that most of the beaches on the East Coast would be gone by the year 2020. When the New York Times isn't busy covering up crimes committed by the Democratic Party, rewriting history is another of their favorite activities. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on these Orwellian climate scamsters for the past 15 years. You can visit him, Kyrie Caesar, Toki Upala, and the four new puppies on the web at realclimatescience.com.